Understanding oxalates. What are oxalates and how do we prevent oxalate issues? In today's video, we're going to take a deep dive into oxalate. We'll discuss what oxalate is, where we find it, how we produce it, how it's absorbed from the gut, how we get rid of it, foods that contain oxalate, and also we're going to end by discussing how you can undertake a low oxalate diet if you need to do so, or whether or not that should even be your target. So we begin by discussing the problems with a long-term low oxalate diet. One of the biggest problems is that most healthy foods contain oxalate. So we'll discuss, whether or not you should undertake a low oxalate diet, the problems with that, and how you should really approach it, simply because if I were to look at a low oxalate diet, I'd look at it similar to any sort of elimination diet or low FODMAP diet. You're going to want to reintroduce at the end. Most people just determine that oxalates are human toxins and they should be removed from the human diet altogether. This is a problem and can actually make an oxalate problem worse, because the most likely scenario where you are going to get the types of bacteria that break down oxalate in your gut is going to be through oxalate in the diet. Next, we'll discuss oxalate exposure in the blood and what determines it. This is determined by two primary factors: endogenous production in the body, which is made as a result of metabolism, but also due to certain foods that we eat, as well as absorption from the gut. This is direct oxalate absorption from the gut from dietary oxalate in our foods. We'll dig in a little deeper on the endogenous oxalate production and what contributes to it. Then we'll move along and we'll discuss oxalate absorption from the gut. Our gut is exquisitely designed to deal with oxalate in our diet, to help us not only remove the oxalate from our diet, but pull the oxalate from our blood that we make endogenously through metabolism. Oxalate absorption varies from the stomach to the colon, and we'll discuss why that is and how that happens. We'll discuss how oxalate absorption occurs. It happens via two primary routes: the paracellular route, which is also caused by leaky gut with the breakdown of the tight junctions, and the transcellular route, which is absorption through cells. This is something that we don't have direct control over, although there are certain things we can add in our diet to prevent us from absorbing oxalate through the transcellular pathway. We're also going to dig into how we remove oxalate from our body. It is via two routes, and it's a dynamic process. We remove it both in our urine and in our feces. This makes sense. You may be familiar with the idea that calcium oxalate stones are the predominant stones in people who form kidney stones. So clearly it's going to be removed from the urine, and when that process is disrupted, perhaps there's inflammation or oxidative stress in the kidney. This can promote the formation of calcium oxalate stones. We also remove it from our feces. In fact, we can bind oxalate within our gastrointestinal tract so that we don't absorb it and it just kind of goes out the back door. We'll also discuss a little bit about oxalate. Oxalate in and of itself isn't bad. Again, this is something that we are exquisitely designed to deal with. It should be a very simple, any that you absorb or any that you make is either removed via the feces or the urine, and we have very sharp mechanisms to take care of this. However, when it combines with calcium in the kidneys, it can form stones. There is also the potential that it may have some other effects in other cells throughout the body. Not a lot of great hard evidence for this, but there does seem to be some anecdotal evidence, as well as personal experiences with people removing oxalate from the diet and feeling better, as there are some case studies and some examples within the literature as well of finding calcium oxalate crystals in tissue. So clearly there is almost certainly other issues with oxalate other than forming stones in the kidneys, so we'll take a look into this. We'll also discuss type 2 diabetes and oxalate. This is truly adding fuel to the fire. The absolute biggest factor in people with the oxalate issues, if you have type 2 diabetes, endogenous production of oxalate is going to ramp up big time. Not only are you going to ramp up endogenous production, but you're also going to increase absorption. Type 2 diabetes is associated with increased intestinal permeability, so you are going to absorb more dietary oxalate from the gut if you have type 2 2 diabetes. Additionally, people with type 2 diabetes are generally over consuming food. The more calories you eat, the more oxalate you are going to put through your digestive tract if you hold everything else constant. And type 2 diabetes in general promotes stone formation. Type 2 diabetes is a risk factor for calcium oxalate stone formers, people with kidney stones and such. And then we're going to end by discussing how to properly address oxalate issues. By the end of this presentation, you should understand how this works, and then these kind of tips and this kind of avenue of addressing oxalate issues will make a lot more sense to you, certainly way more than avoiding otherwise healthy foods such as greens, nuts, and things of that nature. There are another potential significant problems with a long-term low oxalate diet. Now, this does not have to do with our or even a necessity of consuming oxalate in the diet. We do not need oxalate in our body. It's not necessary as far as we know. However, a lot of high oxalate foods are also high in other nutrients that help promote health and healthy aging. Things such as nitric oxide precursors. We find these in leafy greens. The way this works is bacteria help convert nitrates within our leafy greens and other foods, and this eventually leads to the production of nitric oxide within our blood vessels and within our immune cells that help fight infection. This whole process, it requires the intake of dietary nitrate, and a lot of high oxalate foods, specifically leafy greens, are also high in nitrate. Betaine and other methyl donors. Betaine is really, really important, as well as all other methyl donors, in helping regulate gene expression within our cells. Betaine may seem kind of a familiar name. That's because beets are very high in betaine. Beets are also very high in oxalate, and betaine is also found in leafy greens. Polyamines. Polyamines, you may have heard of spermidine as kind of a calorie restriction mimetic. Polyamines just play a really important role in both cell growth, cell replication, DNA regulation, and things of that nature. The things that are high in polyamines are generally grains, legumes, and dairy. Specifically with regard to that, you're going to find it mostly in wheat, soy, and fermented dairy. All fermented foods are going to be high in polyamines. Unfortunately, most people drop grains, legumes, and dairy when they're doing something like a paleo diet. So, they're already restricting these pretty low, and then they decide that they're going to dump oxalate out of their diet. So now they're no longer eating leafy greens or things like that. And finally, nutrients that reduce inflammation and spare NAD+. You may be familiar with NAD+ as one of these kind of popular longevity supplements. We get a lot of NAD precursors in our diet, and these are often found in foods that are also high oxalate. This leads to several potential negative consequences, all kind of just ruining cell health. You're going to see a decreased stem cell pool as well as regenerative potential. What does this mean? This means stem cells help replenish our tissues as they become damaged or as they age. So with a decreased stem cell pool and lower regenerative potential, we're not going to be able to heal or maintain our tissues as well. Increased cell death and poor cell maintenance. This is clearly obvious that you do not want to have excessive cell death and to have poorly maintained cells, so it'll lead to poor cell health, poor organ function. Finally, increased DNA damage and decreased DNA repair. As we get older, certain processes increase, certain processes slow down, and what this ultimately leads to is a lower NAD+ to NADH ratio, and this in and of itself is bad for aging. In fact, this is kind of one of the pathways they're looking at to help kind of promote longevity and health span. So removing oxalate from the diet creates these problems as well as others. Looking at energy metabolism, we will see decreased cellular energy. This is going back to that NAD+ thing. NAD+ is really important for us to make cellular energy. Impaired autophagy. Polyamines play a role in autophagy, which is when we look at autophagy, so you have cells that you're creating, and every once in a while you're going to make some bad cells, or cells are going to get damaged. Autophagy is recycling of the components of these cells. Spermidine, in fact, in addition to being a calorie restriction mimetic, also promotes autophagy, and I'm almost certain that NAD+ is going to play a role there. Increased cellular senescence. So there are multiple ways to kind of go into cellular senescence. Cellular senescence is effectively you have cells that replicate replicate over and over again, but they just at one point decide, you know what, I've had enough, I'm not going to replicate anymore. One of the drivers of increased cellular senescence is a low NAD plus to NADH ratio. Additionally, as cells kind of replicate, the DNA, the caps on the end of the DNA, the telomeres shorten, and once you get to a certain point, a certain number of replications, they turn over. So increased cellular senescence is another thing we may potentially see by depleting kind of preventing ourselves from eating these nutrients because we're avoiding oxalates. Increased oxidative stress and cell damage. Almost every kind of one of the foods that has oxalate in it, when you look at it from a population level, they're generally associated with decreased inflammation and decreased oxidative stress. This in and of it itself does not mean that you yourself should be kind of mainlining these foods and that eating a ton of these foods is great for you specifically, but it tells you as a general kind of trend that people who eat these foods are generally healthier, so they're generally not leading to otherwise poor health outcomes. And you certainly don't want to avoid foods that you don't have to avoid, especially highly nutrient dense foods. Finally, an inability to control inflammation, as I mentioned about NAD+. As we grow older, we get an increase of CD38 activity. This is because we generally see an increase in inflammation. Effectively, we're ramping up macrophages, which are cells of the immune system. So these cells actually consume NAD+. So when we're not getting enough in our diet and we're avoiding otherwise healthy foods, we're not going to be able to control inflammation as well, and we're going to have less NAD+ available to us because we also have this increased inflammation. So basically, many of the consequences of a long-term low oxalate diet is that you are going to kind of be accelerating the aging process, or at the very least accelerating the disease process. So if you understand how oxalate works, understand how to control it, and the more important factors to control than necessarily eliminating oxalate from your diet, you can avoid these negative consequences. Many otherwise healthy foods tend to be high oxalate foods, and this is where it becomes a real problem because these foods contain tons of essential vitamins and minerals that we need to be healthy to prevent diseases deficiency, but they also contain other things such as antioxidants and polyphenols that seem to protect us against cardiovascular disease and cancer. So when we're pulling out these foods, yes, we're reducing the oxalate in our diet, but we're also reducing the overall nutritional quality of our diet. We're talking about foods such as spinach, collard greens, and many other greens, chives, radish, carrots, sweet potato, turnips, and other roots, ginger, beets, dark chocolate, almonds, cashews, and other nuts, and Brussels sprouts. These are all foods that are generally associated with a more healthy dietary pattern. And when you decide you're reducing oxalate, especially if you're also already on a restriction diet anyway, such as low FODMAP for IBS or some other type of autoimmune protocol, when you start pulling out these other foods, you're really causing your food list to dwindle, which in addition to kind of putting you in a precarious situation nutritionally, it also gives you fewer options to pick from when you're consuming foods in your diet. Now that we've kind of talked about dietary oxalate, let's jump in on endogenous oxalate production. Now, before we get into this, it's important to point out that because it's made within your body, this does not mean that endogenous oxalate production is not reliant on nutritional intake. For example, hydroxyproline, which is an amino acid, and ascorbic acid inside our body can be converted into oxalate. So these two things actually play a role. Hydroxyproline is generally found in meats, any sort of animal products. It's a primary component of collagen, so it's found in broth, but there is collagen inside of meats, the kind of the stringy stuff when you're eating steak or chicken, and ascorbic acid, which is a form of vitamin C. When we consume these things and they get into our body can convert them into oxalate. And this plays a role in endogenous oxalate production, which accounts for over 50% of the oxalate that our body is exposed to. Endogenous oxalate is mostly made in the liver, and while both ascorbic acid and hydroxyproline can play a role, glyoxylate is the major precursor to oxalate oxalate production via glyoxylase, which is an enzyme that breaks it down. 5 to 10% of this glyoxylate is going to come from hydroxyproline, and then other contributors are going to be phenylalanine, tryptophan, glucose, fructose, pentose sugars, glycolate, and ethanolamine. So we have these precursors to glyoxylate, which is the major precursor to oxalate production. So when we get glyoxylate within the liver, it is converted into oxalate. So when we're looking at primary hyperoxaluria, this is a condition where these people should almost certainly be limiting the amount of oxalate in their diet. The reasoning behind this is because their metabolism creates so much endogenous oxalate that they really need to look for routes to decrease oxalate exposure as much as possible. These are caused by inborn errors of metabolism. So the best approach here is to decrease glyoxylate synthesis. Unfortunately, it's difficult to do that, so these people kind of need to decrease dietary oxalate. However, approaches to address primary hyperoxaluria are going to look at decreasing either decreasing glyoxylate synthesis or increasing oxalate secretion into the feces. And if the error is in processing glyoxylate into oxalate, the idea would be to make less glyoxylate, which we're going to discuss next. Secondary hyperoxaluria is primarily through increased intake and absorption. You're going to perhaps have people that are just going crazy doing shakes that are loaded with way too much oxalate, juicing spinach or putting spinach, putting handfuls of spinach into a blender, tossing in some beets as well, or increased absorption, which is going to come from other nutrient deficiencies such as calcium, which we'll talk about later, or increased intestinal permeability leading to greater absorption of oxalate from the gut. Glyoxal is a prominent source of glyoxylate. What is glyoxal? Glyoxal is something that is endogenously formed from carbohydrate and ascorbic acid metabolism, and it's formed under oxidative stress, such as protein glycation and lipid peroxidation. So a good example of this is, so you're probably familiar with caramelized onions. You kind of heat them up in a pan, and you get that kind of browning effect. That is glycation. It's effectively the attachment of a sugar to a protein molecule. You may have also heard of the term advanced glycation end products. These things are bad for us. We make them in our body. However, we can also clearly make them as well when you brown food, when you caramelize onions, when you cook food too much, you create advanced glycation end products. And this is a source of glyoxal, which is a prominent source of glyoxylate, which gets converted to oxalate in the liver. There are exogenous sources of glyoxal. For example, there is glyoxal in beer, wine, tea, coffee, yogurt, bread, rice, soybean paste, soy sauce, and oil. Environmental sources of glyoxal are cigarette smoke, smoke from residential log fires, vehicle exhaust, smog, fog, and some household cleaning products. So we can get this stuff into our body. We can consume it in our food. We can breathe it in from our atmosphere, or we can create it as a byproduct of metabolism within inside of us. And the enzymes within our body that contribute to the conversion of glyoxylate to oxalate are aldehyde dehydrogenase and lactate dehydrogenase. This is simply informational purposes. Aldehyde dehydrogenase is, for example, acetaldehyde, which when we convert alcohol in our body, we convert it to acetaldehyde, which is actually more problematic than alcohol, but it is also easier to get rid of. Hopefully you haven't drank too much. And with lactate dehydrogenase, lactate is formed when we exercise. Don't take this to mean that you shouldn't exercise. This is simply an enzyme that's involved in it. As we'll discuss later, lactate dehydrogenase and glyoxal are particularly important when it comes to type 2 diabetes and chronic hyperglycemia. That is one of the kind of tried and true ways of increasing protein glycation and lipid peroxidation, and therefore increasing glyoxal, glyoxylate, and oxalate within the body. We previously mentioned food sources of oxalate and that are otherwise healthy, and now we also have these food sources that are going to contribute to endogenous oxalate production. And on the hydroxyproline side of things, we're talking about things such as animal protein, chicken skin or skin on any animal, really, not just chicken, but the chicken skin is something people commonly eat, especially if they eat things like chicken wings, pork rinds, bone broth, and all sorts of sausages, not because within the sausage is necessarily super high in hydroxyproline, but the casing is made out of collagen, typically intestines, which is high in collagen. So you're going to get a pretty big dose of hydroxyproline via that route as well. And then ascorbic acid, which is vitamin C, is effectively in all fruits and vegetables, but in particular all citrus fruits, broccoli, tomato, and snow peas. So here we can kind of see we can tweak our oxalate exposure by reducing the amount of dietary oxalate we get, but we also have to consider that there are dietary sources of precursors to endogenously produced oxalate, specifically hydroxyproline and ascorbic acid containing foods. Let's now dive into oxalate absorption in the gut. You will absorb dietary oxalate from your gut. It's normal. It varies from the stomach to the colon. And even in healthy individuals, you're going to see some absorption from the stomach. This becomes worse with gastroparesis. Gastroparesis is effectively delayed gastric emptying. In other words, contents stay in your stomach longer than they should. Gastro meaning stomach, paresis meaning paralyzed. And this can come about for multiple reasons. You can have gastroparesis as a very specific condition. It's very common in people with type 2 diabetes because one of the ways we regulate our blood glucose levels is by slowing down gastric emptying. So as foods high in oxalates kind of sit in the stomach and swirl around, the acidic pH increases the absorption of oxalate from the stomach. That's why we do see absorption from the stomach. Then we move along into the small intestine. There's very low absorption of oxalate from the small intestine. That's for a couple reasons we'll discuss in a moment, as well as the proximal colon, which is the first part of the large intestine. Under normal conditions, if you have leaky gut, if you have poor digestion, if you have gastrointestinal problems, you'll likely absorb more oxalate than what is normal from the small intestine and the proximal colon. We do see the highest absorption of oxalate in the distal colon. That's the part when we're looking at the colon, you're talking about the descending colon, the sigmoid colon, and down into the rectum. This is the area where we get the highest absorption of oxalate, and this is going to depend on a couple of factors. It's going to depend on net oxalate absorption versus oxalate secretion and degradation. So what is that? Oxalate absorption is pulling the oxalate from your gut into the blood. Secretion is pulling the oxalate from your blood and pulling it into your gut. Now, this is going to happen both, say, you absorb dietary oxalate in your stomach, it's going to circulate, and you're going to be able to eventually pull that into your gut via secretion. But also, when we look at endogenously produced oxalate, we're going to pull some of that into the gut as well. So this is basically any oxalate that's inside the body. In addition to being lost in the urine, we can pull it back into the gut. So one of the best things about this is if we pull it back into the gut, or even if we just consume oxalate in our diet, oxalate will bind with calcium and magnesium, and this renders the oxalate to stay in the gut. You cannot absorb calcium or magnesium oxalate from the gut under normal conditions. So this will prevent absorption of dietary oxalate as well as reabsorption of endogenously produced oxalate. Additionally, lowering fat intake decreases oxalate absorption. And why is this? Because when we have a high fat diet, this kind of prevents this calcium and oxalate binding in the gut, so they remain free, and it's more easily absorbed from the gut when you also have a high fat diet. So in addition to making sure you're consuming adequate calcium and magnesium, you also want to make sure you're not consuming too much fat, or you will have increased oxalate absorption from the gut. There are two primary routes of oxalate absorption. First, there is paracellular transport, paracellular meaning between cells. This is what we see when we have quote-unquote leaky gut, increased intestinal permeability. Effectively, oxalate's able to pass between cells because we don't have appropriate levels of tight junction proteins holding the cells together. This increases in proportion to the leakiness, so the more quote-unquote leaky your gut is, the more oxalate you're going to absorb. There's also transcellular transport, and this is oxalate absorption through the cells. This doesn't really have much to do with leaky gut. Some of this is passive transport. In the small intestine and the proximal colon, there is net secretion back into the gut. So while in the small intestine and proximal colon, you can have some passive transport of oxalate from the gut into the blood, you have these transporters taking as much oxalate as they can from the blood in pumping them back into the gut. So overall, you're not going to see oxalate absorption. You're going to see net secretion or loss of oxalate from the blood. It becomes more problematic in the distal colon, where we do not have net secretion necessarily. Part of this is controlled by the microbes we have in our gut. For example, Oxalobacter formigenes actually kind of settles itself near these oxalate transporters that pull oxalate from the blood into the gut. So what the Oxalobacter is doing is they're effectively hitting a button saying secrete more oxalate, pulling the oxalate into the gut so that the Oxalobacter can have access to the oxalate. It's actually kind of pretty cool. But we really aren't going to see absorption provided that the oxalate is bound to either calcium or magnesium. It is important to point out that longer transit times, in other words, if you're not regular, if you have poor motility, if stuff just kind of sits in that distal colon, if food just sits there and you don't really go to the bathroom often, you're going to absorb more oxalate if it's not bound to magnesium and calcium. As I just mentioned, there are a number of oxalate-degrading bacteria that can help. The one we just mentioned, Oxalobacter formigenes, but there are also members of the Lactobacillus and Bifidobacterium strains that are helpful. We used to believe that Oxalobacter was the only helpful oxalate-degrading bacteria, and so that's kind of where this whole oxalate hysteria came about. If you don't have Oxalobacter formigenes, you are going to have problems with oxalate because you don't break them down. That does not turn out to be true. There are dozens of members of our microbiome that can degrade oxalate. We don't necessarily know if they can work as Oxalobacter does by increasing secretion, but they possibly can. But there are a number of members of our microbiome that are useful for helping us break down oxalate, so that if we do get a substantial amount of free oxalate in our distal colon, that we don't have to necessarily worry about absorption. The best strains that are acid and bile tolerant and colonized, meaning they'll make it through the stomach and colonize in the colon, include Lactobacillus fermentum TY5, Lactobacillus fermentum AB1, and Lactobacillus salivarius AB11. These are all shown to colonize, so you can hopefully take them and they'll stick around so that they can help you break down oxalate. However, even strains that don't colonize may contain oxalate-degrading enzymes that are useful for you, especially when taken with oxalate-containing foods. We're talking about Enterococcus faecalis and Rett-Gary, Streptococcus thermophilus, Lactobacillus plantarum, Gassericia, Casei, acidophilus, and rhamnosus. If those names are familiar to you, that's because they are loaded in yogurts and kefir and many fermented dairy products, as is Bifidobacterium infantis and animalis. We find these in a lot of foods, so adding these foods that contain these strains, and even potentially if you're taking a supplement that kind of contains these strains, they may not effectively on their own degrade oxalate, but they do contain oxalate degrading enzymes within them that you're going to break open and potentially help degrade oxalate as well. We eliminate oxalate from our body either through the urine via the kidneys or through the feces via the intestine. This is a dynamic process with absorption, reabsorption, and secretion chronically going on. So it's not like a one-way process, like you eat dietary oxalate, you either absorb it or poop it out, then it goes from the blood into the kidney, and then you either pee it out or it kind of stays there. This is just going on all the time. It's absorbing, secreting, reabsorbing, secreting. This goes on all throughout the day. And what this means is that oxalate consumed, produced throughout the day will continually enter, leave, and re-enter the kidney and gut until you go to the bathroom or you urinate and get rid of it. So, you kind of want to be doing these things regularly. So based on these principles, it probably makes more sense that oxalate should be consumed earlier in the day for people with oxalate issues, especially because as you're consuming foods throughout the day, you're going to also be consuming calcium and magnesium, and hopefully this will help trap both the oxalate oxalate that is included in your diet with these foods, as well as oxalate that kind of circulates through the body, it's going to trap it once it enters the gut. That way, it's just out the back door. At this point, we have a very good idea of where our exposure to oxalate is coming from. The simplest is from diet. We're consuming actual oxalate that we can absorb from our digestive tract. We also have endogenously produced oxalate, which is coming primarily from the liver and is a byproduct of just regular metabolism, but also high intake of dietary endogenous oxalate precursors. So we're talking about hydroxyproline and ascorbic acid. And then of course we're absorbing this into our body, we're processing it, we're dumping it into our feces, we're dumping it into our urine to get rid of it. So now let's kind of see what happens when we put the rubber to the road. In 2009, they did a comparison of diets, and what they did is they took people with mild hyperoxaluria and they put them on a low animal protein and salt and a normal calcium diet. So why these specific features? The low animal protein will reduce endogenous oxalate production precursors. Salt simply increases the likelihood that we're going to form calcium oxalate stones in the kidney. So it's not really affecting oxalate exposure, more so it's increasing the likelihood that you're going to form stones when there is a high oxalate excretion via the urine. And normal calcium, meaning we are consuming enough calcium to bind oxalate in the gut so we absorb less. So they took these people and they put them on this diet for 3 months and they measured their urinary oxalate output. And why do we do this? It's really the only simple way. You're not going to run around collecting people's feces and measuring it for oxalate. It's just easier to measure the amount of oxalate in the urine. And they compared this to a traditional low oxalate diet in people who produce kidney stones. And what they found was the people who ate this low animal protein, low salt, normal calcium diet had a 29.2% reduction in urinary oxalate. In other words, a 29% reduction in their oxalate exposure compared to a 12.7% reduced urinary oxalate excretion in the low oxalate diet. So they more than doubled the amount of reduction. So this low animal protein, salt, normal calcium diet reduced oxalate exposure by more than twofold versus a low oxalate diet. And what this simply shows you is that on the surface, it makes more sense to consume less dietary oxalate, but dietary oxalate does not seem to contribute as much to oxalate exposure as endogenously produced oxalate. And it seems as such that if you're going to use diet as a lever to improve oxalate exposure, you're more likely to see better effects by reducing endogenous oxalate precursors than, overt dietary oxalate in the diet. But it's important to point out in this study, when we looked at what these people were eating before, keeping in mind that they had mildly elevated urinary oxalate prior to, the people in the low animal protein, salt, normal calcium diet, their average calcium intake before the study was 585 milligrams. In other words, they were calcium deficient. So we can't really say that this was totally due to a reduction in animal protein intake, which would reduce endogenous oxalate precursors. What it is doing is taking them from effectively a 50% calcium nutritional deficiency, bringing them up to fully replete in dietary calcium, and that certainly is going to play a role. So if we're looking at the major exposures here, low calcium seems to consistently pop up in these studies where they find that dietary oxalate is a problem. So just make sure you're consuming enough calcium. People simply don't do that anymore. This kind of brings up kind of where we stand at this point, that oxalate in and of itself isn't bad. In fact, if you look at our evolutionary history, we've been exposed to oxalate for most of it. I mean, if you look at the foods that have it, it's generally going to be green leafy things and vegetables and things of that nature. We are primates, so we come from a lineage of, quote unquote vegans or herbivores that expanded their diet during times of need. And now, we're omnivores, we're meat eaters. So simply absorbing oxalate into our body isn't a big deal. And we don't simply, back when kind of the oxalate hysteria area started, we used to think that if you didn't have oxalobacter, you were just basically screwed. But we understand that that's not the case now. We understand how the body absorbs, secretes, how we make oxalate. We understand this is not as simple as just consuming dietary oxalate and it's a toxin, especially since you don't generally create quote unquote toxins in your body. Oxalate is just a byproduct of metabolism that we are expertly equipped to deal with. So having oxalate in your diet, not a big deal. Absorbing oxalate from your gut, not a big deal. Most issues with oxalate are due to calcium oxalate stone formation, which can happen in the kidney, and there is evidence that it happens elsewhere. But these are almost always involving some other step, like a calcium deficient diet, or a super high fat diet, or type 2 diabetes, or high levels of oxidative stress in the body. It's not simply just oxalate's bad. So we want to look at things that will prevent us from form calcium oxalate stones. For example, macrophage polarization. So macrophages are phagocytic cells of our immune system, and they can be polarized to either an inflammatory state or an anti-inflammatory state. And this is dictated by oxidative stress and inflammation. This is how we form calcium oxalate stones. So ideally, we want to maintain those macrophages in the anti-inflammatory M2 form, and this prevents stone formation. Tons of evidence on this. We know that this is what's happening. We know you're unlikely to form calcium oxalate stones in your kidneys unless you also have oxidative stress. We also know that you're going to see that the macrophages are polarized to the M1 inflammatory form in order to cause stone formation. And worse yet, once you start forming stones, this causes more oxidative stress, which attracts the inflammatory M1 macrophages to the kidney and causes the problem to become worse. So the idea here is not to necessarily make sure you have no oxalate in your body at any time. It's to make sure you're not producing too much, and to, in the event you are producing too much, to have low levels of oxidative stress and inflammation, which are the primary drivers of the problem, not necessarily oxalate intake. So when we understand at some point that oxalates are problems for some people, we want to know the environmental conditions in which this happens, so we sort of do. So what are the cellular pathways that are going to kind of promote calcium oxalate crystal formation? And if we can look at these things, how do we kind of manipulate these pathways to make sure that that doesn't happen? So we have the sirtuin-3 NAD nutrient sensing pathway. This helps maintain macrophages in the anti-inflammatory M2 polarization. It prevents calcium oxalate stone formation via heme oxygenase 1, which is something that I've covered a lot in my circadian rhythm program, as well as something I've covered in some blogs on the site. Heme oxygenase 1 is critically important for circadian rhythms. It's critically important for maintaining a healthy body, and it's a stress response pathway that we do have some level of control over. We also, when we kind of tweak this SIRT3 NAD pathway, this prevents oxidative stress-induced injury. It effectively makes us more resilient to oxidative stress and cellular stress. Trying to activate sirtuin-3 without fasting will likely fail. Sirtuin-3 is an NAD plus dependent enzyme. So what that means is it uses NAD as a cofactor. In other words, you can try to activate SIRT3 as much as you want, but if you don't also have adequate NAD, or if you do not have a high NAD plus to NADH ratio, you won't be able to actually get the effect you're looking for. NAD plus is the limiting factor. Fasting increases NAD plus and it activates sirtuin-3. So this is kind of how there is a circadian rhythm of oxalate, and there's certainly a circadian rhythm of our metabolism, which is going to play a role in the formation of glyoxylate and the metabolism, different factors in metabolism that we discussed earlier. So having periods of fasting and feasting generally kind of tweaks this NAD plus and active SIRT3 pathway to activation, periods of activation versus periods of non-activation, and this is overall helpful for us. NAD plus supplements may be useful in older folk, probably not that useful in younger adults. We can also kind of skew this pathway via exercise. So, you shouldn't really look at it as, fasting is the best way to do this. Ultimately, as long as you're having a feeding and fasting window, I don't generally see the benefit in intermittent fasting. In other words, taking entire days off of food or, multiple days off of food, completely unnecessary. Just observe a normal feeding fasting window. CD38 is the primary consumer of NAD+. CD38 is effectively an NAD consuming enzyme that once we get inflammation consumes NAD. So in order to prevent this from happening, we want to make sure that we are not increasing oxidative stress or inflammation. Additionally, there are CD38 inhibitors such as quercetin and epigenin that can help increase SIRT3 NAD signaling. We'll discuss those in a moment, but it's interesting. Most people are going to look at this and say, okay, I need to take an NAD plus supplement, and maybe I'm going to start taking an epigenin supplement or a quercetin supplement. Not even remotely useful. If those things have an effect, it's a marginal effect. Overall, the biggest driver of this is going to be two things. It's going to be your lifestyle and your age. And so you have control of one, but not the other. Supplements may be useful to tweak this a little bit, but I wouldn't look at that as the primary way of doing this. Living a better lifestyle and keeping low levels of oxidative stress and inflammation are by far more important than popping a supplement. And that is the perfect segue into the next topic, type 2 diabetes and oxalate, adding fuel to the fire. In fact, I'd make the argument that the type 2 diabetes is the fire and the fuel. So hyperglycemia and type 2 diabetes are the absolute biggest problem you could have with regard to oxalate. For one, people with prediabetes and type 2 diabetes generally have an increased intestinal permeability, so they have higher levels of leaky gut, which means they're going to absorb more oxalate from their diet. It's going to also increase glyoxylate production even when you're in the pre-diabetic stage. So now you have a leakier gut, you're increasing your oxalate absorption, and you're creating more. Interestingly, we kind of mentioned earlier that collagen, is a source of hydroxyproline. Collagen is also something that becomes glycated. So you're breaking this down. You're effectively increasing the amount of substrate to make glyoxylate, and you're also at the same time increasing oxidative stress, inflammation, and CD38. So in other words, what are you doing here? You got type 2 diabetes, prediabetes. You're going to make more oxalate. You're going to absorb more oxalate. You're going to make more calcium oxalate stones because you have increased oxidative stress and inflammation. And you're going to maintain an environment that predisposes you to these problems because you have low sirtuin-3 NAD activity, and you have increased M1 polarization. So you're effectively making yourself an oxalate absorbing and creating machine. So the risk to the kidneys is way worse. This is one of the reasons why type 2 diabetics often, as the disease progresses, end up on dialysis. It's terrible for your kidneys. It's terrible for your gut as well. So in terms of improving the effect of an oxalate issue you may have, if you have type 2 diabetes or prediabetes, you absolutely have to correct that. It should be the first thing on your list. You really, I know a high oxalate or a low oxalate diet is more appealing than losing weight and reestablishing healthy glycemic management. The problem is it's really cutting the oxalates out of your diet is not the issue. And as we've kind of discussed multiple times in the blogs and groups, restriction begets more restriction. And so once you start restricting some things, you're going to have to restrict more things. They become more problematic. And this is just not a path you really want to go down. On top of all this, you're going to have the glyoxylate problem, the oxalate absorption problem, and you don't necessarily need to have type 2 diabetes to have these problems. You're also going to experience hyperglycemia, which is going to cause gastroparesis. So stuff is going to sit in your stomach longer. You're going to have delayed gastric emptying. You're going to have this kind of acidic environment that promotes oxalate absorption. So you're going to absorb more oxalate. Even if you don't have leaky gut, you're going to absorb more from your stomach. And then we also want to take into account that type 2 diabetes is typically associated with microbial dysbiosis. So you're going to see a decrease in the oxalate degrading bacteria in your gut. So point blank, you cannot fix an oxalate problem without fixing type 2 diabetes if you have it. So that should be one of your first things to address. So one of the kind of interesting things we see with type 2 diabetes and overt just kind of impaired metabolism is increased oxalate production in the liver. Now there's a study published in 2021 kind of looking at what happens in fatty liver and how that affects oxalate. And this kind of also plays a role within that type 2 diabetes increasing oxalate as well. We have this twin cycle hypothesis of type 2 diabetes, and what it says is people have a personal fat threshold upon which once they store body fat in their subcutaneous compartments, they're genetically predetermined that they can only store so much, and once they exceed that, we start putting fat into the liver. And as the liver begins to get fatty, this actually drives hyperglycemia because the liver regulates blood glucose control. So what happens in this early period, which would not even be overt type 2 diabetes, this would be possibly even before prediabetes, is we're getting this fat accumulation in the liver. This is increasing hyperglycemia, which is going to increase glyoxylate and increase oxalate production. And on top of that, we have altered glyoxylate metabolism, which increases oxalate as well. So as you can see in this image, we have on the right hand side, we have much more oxalate being produced, which is going to increase the oxalate exposure to the kidneys and increase the risk for calcium oxalate stones, but it's also increasing the amount of oxalate that's traveling through your entire body. It's important to point out too that fatty liver is associated with increased intestinal permeability, so that may also be playing a role. Things like type 2 diabetes and fatty liver and other drivers of cardiometabolic dysfunction, they're not simply just one-trick ponies. There are a lot of bad things going on that need to be addressed, and that's why it's so important to correct anything related to cardiometabolic disease, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver, etc., etc. Now, one thing that does seem to be common in this kind of oxalate picture is that a lot of people who go on a restriction diet eventually find out that they're, quote unquote, also sensitive to oxalates, or they have problems processing oxalates. But this is not all that surprising when we look at the full dietary picture of certain individuals and what certain individuals happen to be eating. And so we can look at, essentially all different types of restriction diets that restrict certain types of food. And we can look at these diets and see that a lot of the times the diet that people choose to follow within these restriction diets actually promotes an oxalate problem. So let's just kind of go over a few. We'll begin with a paleo low carb diet. A lot of people will do these for food intolerances. Some people will do these to improve type 2 diabetes. I kind of became exposed to the low carb paleo community because I had prediabetes and I was looking to improve it. So what you do is within the paleo framework, you are removing grains, legumes, and dairy from your diet. Now, what happens when you remove dairy from your diet? You are reducing the amount of calcium you're getting. And a lot of the times, a lot of the other kind of sources of calcium are going to be things like spinach, which are also high in oxalate. On top of that, if you're going low carb, and even if you're not going low carb, a lot of paleo folk increase their fat intake. That's problematic because fat will increase the amount of oxalate you absorb. It interferes with the binding of calcium to oxalate. So now you have free oxalate floating in your digestive tract. You're much more likely to absorb that into your body. Additionally, one thing that seems to be common in this crowd is increasing nut consumption. And that's not simply just snacking on cashews or almonds or things of that nature. A lot of the times you're replacing bread and snacks and treats with things made out of nut flours. You may overconsume nut butter. So you're getting this really high load of oxalate. And you believe that, hey, I'm looking through my diet. I see, wow, I'm eating a lot of oxalate. So I must have an oxalate problem, which leads them to restrict oxalates and pull them out of their diet as well. The problem is the oxalate isn't necessarily the driver. You have increased fat, more animal protein, which can lead to increased endogenous oxalate production, but probably the biggest factor is lower calcium intake. So this is going to increase the oxalate absorption even if you kept oxalates low, and you would see an increase in urinary oxalate in these people. They don't have an oxalate problem. They have a crappy version of the paleo or low carb diet problem. And that's not something that you have to get off of a paleo or low carb diet to do. It's something that you need to look in deeper, dig into, and find out what the actual problem is, rather than just identify that you have a problem with oxalates and that oxalates are toxic to everyone, so you must remove them from your diet. So now, in addition to being paleo and low carb, you're also low oxalate, which further reduces your different types of foods to have in your diet, so lower diet diversity. We can also look at people with irritable bowel syndrome. People with irritable bowel syndrome are more prone to oxalate issues. Sometimes in IBS studies, we see increased intestinal permeability. Sometimes we don't. So we can kind of assume that these people have digestive problems. They have IBS. So there's the potential for increased intestinal permeability, which is going to increase their oxalate absorption. But then they move into a low FODMAP diet. Low FODMAP diet reduces sources of fiber. It also, a lot of people will just remove dairy, whether they have a lactose intolerance or not, which is going to cause oxalate problems because it's going to reduce calcium intake. Soluble fiber is a problem because soluble fiber can bind with fat in the digestive tract. So removing all of the fiber in your diet make more fat available to prevent the binding of calcium to oxalate. And type 2 diabetes is more common in people with IBS. So you have all of these things going on. You hit that low FODMAP diet, and particularly if you reduce your calcium. If you reduce your calcium, it's less likely to become a problem. So now you have increased oxalate absorption from your just from having IBS because you're more prone to intestinal permeability. You have more oxalate production, particularly if you have type 2 diabetes. You're removing dairy, so you are absorbing more oxalate. It's not binding with calcium. So you see, hey, I have an oxalate problem. So you decide to restrict your oxalates. Instead, would have been way better to identify, hey, maybe I don't have lactose intolerance. Maybe I should find out if I have lactose intolerance. And if I do, then rather than completely removing dairy from my diet, I will remove dairy that contains lactate. I'll take a lactase enzyme and kind of focus more on a lower fat dairy. That way your fat intake decreases, so that if you are eating a higher fat intake, say you're eating more meat or things of that nature, that's not necessarily bad. However, if you're also reducing calcium and eating other things that are higher in fat, that could prevent that calcium from being able to prevent oxalate from being absorbed. So you don't have an oxalate problem due to too much dietary oxalate and because oxalates are toxic to you. You have an oxalate problem because the very specific version of the low FODMAP or IBS diet that you chose has some kinks that need to be worked out, that if you work out those kinks, you probably will no longer have an oxalate problem. And finally, let's take a look at the vegan diet. We talked about kind of higher animal protein diets being problematic. A vegan diet can be problematic as well, especially a raw vegan diet. Cooking breaks down oxalate, so if you don't cook your food, it's going to have its maximal amount of oxalate in it. Also, vegan diets tend to be no dairy and low in calcium. They may supplement with it, but since they're not eating dairy products, they're going to be low in calcium, and that's going to increase oxalate absorption. They're going to have a generally high oxalate intake. They're also going to have a high ascorbic acid intake, especially when relying on juices and smoothies. I know people think juices and smoothies, especially when they're made with mostly vegetables and some fruit, are super healthy, but they can be an oxalate bomb, way more than you would be exposed to if you're eating whole unprocessed foods. And the other problem is a lot of the common juices that vegans like to consume are very high in oxalate. Juice amplifies the oxalate content because you're usually taking a lot of something, and when you juice it, you have all this kind of material you toss, but the juice kind of concentrates the oxalate. And so when we look at, what are people consuming in these juices, spinach, beets, and celery are all very common, and they're all high oxalate. And additionally, nuts are normally relied upon as a protein source. Soy as well, and soy is certain forms of soy are high oxalate. But the problem is you are eating a lot of substitutes, foods that are kind of meant to be another food, and a lot of these are made out of nuts. So you're looking at like vegan milks. There's nut milks, there's almond milk, there's cashew milk. There's a million different types of milks made with nuts. Those are typically not going to be as problematic because they're not high amounts of nuts, but if they're coupled with high nut intake, they can be problematic. Cheeses, these are a problem because these are heavily concentrated, dense sources of nuts. So you're really increasing your oxalate intake. If you're raw as well and not cooking your food, that's going to become a problem. So you are going to not only expose yourself to more oxalate, but potentially absorb more of it too, because you're not consuming enough calcium, and also depending on what else you're eating in your diet. If you're relying on high sources of fat, generally speaking, a vegan diet is going to be lower in fat, so that's going to be less of a problem than the calcium deficiency issue. Now that you sat through this science lesson, and I beat that whole type 2 diabetes horse to death, we can talk about properly addressing oxalate issues. Before we go on, I should say this again, fix type 2 diabetes first. If you fix type 2 diabetes first, that is going to be the biggest leg room. And you know what? I understand type 2 diabetes is not on a list of easy things to do. It requires a lot of work. We've done a video on that you can check out called What is Type 2 Diabetes and How You Reverse It. And we broke that up into two different videos. One, what is type 2 diabetes and how do you reverse type 2 diabetes? Check those out. We have tons of data on this. The primary hypothesis, the leading hypothesis, has only been reaffirmed every time it's been studied. So we do know how to do this. It's just difficult to do because it requires weight loss. Next, follow gut-friendly protocols. Some examples of this, have a 12 hours or less eating window to help kind of promote this proper sirtuin-3 NAD periods of activation and inhibition. Space your meals out to promote motility via the migrating motor complex. This is a fasting program that moves things through our gut a little more quickly. Decrease your fat consumption to decrease your oxalate absorption, and of course increase your calcium intake. Regular calorie restriction to promote sirtuin-3 NAD activity. Now this is separate. This is not time restricted eating. This is not a 12-hour eating window. Do not overeat your calories. Over the long term, chronic caloric excess is going to promote type 2 diabetes, and it's going to also promote oxidative stress and inflammation. If you're looking for a program to help you out, we do have two programs that are specifically kind of geared towards not necessarily oxalate absorption, but making your gut resilient and strong so that you won't deal with things like oxalate or leaky gut. You can strictly follow the Stop Leaky Gut Challenge, which is a 12-week program, or the Ultimate Gut Health Bundle, which is a lifelong program to help you develop good gut health and maintain it throughout your life. Consume foods higher in oxalate first thing in the morning with calcium or magnesium. Make sure you are consuming calcium and magnesium throughout the day so that any of the endogenously produced oxalate that gets pulled into your gut gets bound to calcium and magnesium, and decrease your fat intake so calcium and magnesium can bind to oxalate. Maintain higher sirtuin-3 activity to prevent stone formation. This is, again, from the gut-friendly protocols. And lower oxidative stress and the inflammatory state, which will also be, which you can do through the gut-friendly protocols, as well as getting adequate exercise throughout the day. Consume a high calcium and magnesium diet. You want to space this throughout the day, and particularly around periods of time where you may be consuming high oxalate food so that it binds the oxalate in the gut and sends it out the back door and prevents reabsorption. One interesting thing that we covered in a blog, which we will link to in the description of the video, is that one of the primary ways to increase the amount of oxalate degrading bacteria in your gut is to increase your oxalate intake. So one of the problems is when people have problems with oxalates, they just cut oxalate out of their diet, where this actually lowers their ability to deal with oxalate. You don't want to do this. We have tons of data on this. The best way to make your body better deal with oxalate is to make sure you have some oxalate in your diet, and when we can consume higher calcium and lower fat, this can help us consume this oxalate so it's sticking around, and then microbes such as Lactobacillus bifidobacterium, or specifically Oxalobacter formigenes, can help us deal with oxalate by breaking it down and potentially even increasing secretion in the distal colon. Consume probiotics or probiotic foods that have oxalate degrading bacteria within them. With the foods that have oxalate, these enzymes can help break down the oxalate. Some of the foods also contain colonizing microbes, especially when you're looking at things like fermented dairy, especially yogurt or kefir. They contain both non-colonizing and colonizing microbes that can help break down the oxalate that's in the food that you're consuming. Consume oxalate degrading bacteria that also colonize the colon, and this is going to require you to maintain some oxalate levels in the diet, or these are simply just not going to stick around. You can consume NAD plus boosters. Again, I don't think this is a big factor. In fact, I've taken specifically nicotinamide riboside before, and I did not see any beneficial effect whatsoever on any health outcome. I suspect that these things are probably beneficial for people who are, towards the elderly range or just don't exercise. Personally, I think you're going to get better effects from exercise, but if for some reason you can't, or you're older, you may need to supplement with nicotinamide riboside or nicotinamide mononucleotide to kind of help move things along. Nicotinamide, which is kind of the basic kind of niacin that is in supplements, take that as well. That may also be helpful. Consume CD38 inhibitors to decrease oxidative stress inflammation and to promote that kind of anti-inflammatory M2 macrophage polarization and increase your NAD plus levels. We're looking at apigenin, which is found in chamomile tea and celery, as well as quercetin, which is found in onions and hot peppers. Ultimately, I don't take supplements. I don't recommend people take supplements. I recommend that they get a better diet. In fact, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think these oxalate issues are not a problem with oxalates per se, but just the formation of a deficient or kind of generally crappy diet that predisposes to oxalate issues. I don't think you should restrict otherwise healthy foods simply because your diet isn't very good. You should improve your diet so that oxalates no longer become an issue and your gut becomes more resilient. If you can completely avoid it, try not to go down the restriction rabbit hole. You're just going to start pulling foods out of your diet. You're going to pull more and more foods until you're eventually eating nothing. So, especially if you do, there's nothing wrong with having a paleo or low carb lifestyle. There's nothing wrong with, having a vegan lifestyle. And if you have IBS, clearly the low FODMAP diet is beneficial for most people who undertake it. So that's not to say that you should not do these diets. What it's saying is if you identify that you have an oxalate problem, rather than also restricting oxalates, try finding what portions of your diet and your lifestyle may actually be driving the problem, rather than just saying, well, restriction worked for me once, I'm just going to restrict more and more foods. Oxalates are a problem for me now, I'm not eating them anymore. Make sure you cook your food. Cook as much of your food as you can. If you have an oxalate problem, for sure cooking your food will reduce the amount of dietary oxalate you consume. Hydrate, drink lots of water. That helps you flush out the oxalate that's in your body. And one thing you can do is mineralize your water. So what do I mean by this? The different companies make mineral drops to mineralize your water. One of the more common and popular ones is called concentrates. Why do this? How does it benefit? Generally, there is a high dose of magnesium and sometimes calcium as well. So, for example, in concentrates, what they recommend you take has around 250 milligrams of magnesium in it. So if you're adding this to your water at whatever concentration you choose, you're going to be putting magnesium into your gut all day long. That magnesium can bind oxalate if it's in there and prevent it from being absorbed if it gets down to the colon. So we have a lot of things we can do to address oxalate issues that don't simply involve adding another group of foods to your dietary restriction list. So use these tools. They're much more effective based on the evidence. And if you have any issues with oxalates, look first to what you can do with making your diet better and more nutritious and your lifestyle healthier, rather than going, all right, let's pull oxalates out of my diet now too. Now, which food should you increase? This has so much inter-individual variability that it's hard to say. You have to take into consideration other sensitivities that most people should have. I should point out that the problem is most people are just going to restrict and remain restricted. You really need to observe a very short period of restriction when you're doing any sort of restriction diet, whether it be low FODMAP, low salicylates, low oxalates. You want to follow food reintroduction procedures. For example, you may want to restrict oxalates or what have you for 2 to 3 months, but then you want to start reintroducing food so that you can have a an optimum diet for you. In our Stop Leaky Gut Challenge and our Ultimate Gut Health Challenge, we do have a gut optimization protocol for determining which foods are right for you, how to introduce them, when to reintroduce them. You don't necessarily have to use our way, but you really should use a pragmatic way of restriction followed by food and reintroduction. People get into these problems all the time. They're like, okay, I'm going to go paleo or keto to lose weight, and then all of a sudden they find that they don't really tolerate foods with oxalates, which lo and behold is because they're not consuming enough calcium and they're consuming much higher amounts of animal proteins as well as a high amount of fat in their diet, which is going to predispose them to an oxalate issue that they never had. It's going to make them more sensitive to oxalates. This is kind of why we have this whole restriction begets restriction. You start restricting certain foods. With paleo, it's grains, legumes, and dairy, which also tend to be higher in calcium and contain some level of oxalates in their diet, as well as healthy, otherwise healthy nutrients that you're simply not going to get anywhere. They start doing that, and all of a sudden, oh, my gut is messed up. I really cannot consume oxalates. Well, the problem isn't that oxalates are toxins and inherently toxin to all people. It's that you are following a protocol of diet that is not good for consuming oxalates. Same with keto. If it's higher fat and for some reason you've eliminated dairy from your diet, which many people tend to do, it's going to lead to a problem where you can't tolerate oxalates. So the idea here is to increase the diversity in your diet so you tolerate oxalates, not to pull something else out of your diet. Eventually you're going to get into a position where you're really not eating anything and your diet is just garbage altogether and of low nutrient density. Now you're taking 15 or 20 supplements to take care of the foods that you can't eat because you feel you're sensitive to them. For those of you in the Stop Leaky Gut Challenge and the Circadian Retraining Program, we have covered this in the private groups. We've dropped the gut optimization protocol in there, so you can access this to help increase your diet diversity and to help correct any issues you may be having with oxalate. Here's a list of foods with higher apigenin and quercetin content. We'll put this into the description. There's a really good paper that kind of gives you an idea of different flavonoids in different vegetables, so you can kind of make your pick from there. Again, I can't say it enough, you really should be getting all of your nutrients from food, and you really shouldn't rely on supplements, especially people with gut issues that I see you're taking 15 or 20 different supplements that you don't even really need, especially when there are ways to kind of respond to these issues and correct these issues that have nothing to do with supplements. Supplements, they have their uses in certain conditions. They may even be useful in helping to kind of correct an oxalate issue, but I don't think long term they're very useful at all. So that wraps it up. Thanks for listening in. I hope that you took from this that the solution to you having an oxalate problem is not necessarily greater restriction of foods. In fact, we showed you with the paper we discussed that a low oxalate diet doesn't even outperform a diet that is adequate in calcium, low in animal protein, and low in salt for urinary oxalate excretion from the body. So the problem that I find is that once people kind of get into these restriction diets, they tend to have to restrict more. Restriction begets more restriction. Most people have no idea. If you cut dairy out of your diet, you're cutting a substantial portion of calcium from your diet. This can, in and of itself, create a problem where you absorb too much oxalate, or you're unable to get rid of the oxalate that you create in your body because it's just going to circulate and not be able to bind to calcium in the digestive tract. So what we really want to do is, yes, food restriction can be beneficial. It should be short term and immediately followed with reintroduction. But on top of that, when you're in that restriction phase, you need to make sure that you're getting all of the nutrients you need for your body to work properly. Again, as we mentioned, say you decide to go paleo to lose weight or keto to lose weight. Now you're not eating dairy, or you're eating a high level of fat, and an oxalate load in a person like that is probably going to be a problem for that individual. But the problem isn't that oxalates are toxins. The problem is the person has put themselves in a state where oxalates become a problem. Correct the state, correct the problem. So thank you for listening to our video. Hope you paid some attention, learned some things. Hope this is going to kind of get you to lean more towards the increasing diet diversity and correcting the problems, rather than just focusing on something in the diet and cutting it out. If you like this video, please share it on social media. Don't forget to subscribe. These are the kind of things we want to cover. These myths that a lot of people are saying, oxalates are human toxins and you should never consume them. If you have any questions, comments, or constructive criticisms, put them down in the list below. Thank you very much for listening in. Share us on social media. Can't say it enough. Please subscribe to the channel. That's how we know that you like what we're doing and that we should continue pumping it out. And thank you very much for listening in. Take care.